Hi guys, I'm back with some updates. It's been a while since I've been on here, so I feel like I have a lot to share. And I even wrote a bunch of notes. See me looking down. That's what I'm doing. Um, I'm going to talk about my physical health and kind of what's been going on with that. I'm going to talk about my mental health and starting therapy. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about an update with my son Jackson and his speech delay. So that'll be kind of towards the end. I think I left off on the last video where I was on IV antibiotics at home. I had that PICC line in my arm, and things were really going well after starting IV antibiotics. I didn't have any bleeding for weeks, was feeling good. And then within about, I think, a week and a half or so of starting IV antibiotics, my husband got really sick. And Ellie had been sick when I first started IV antibiotics. So we think she probably brought it home. Chad got sick, then Jackson got sick, and then I got sick. And we think it was influenza because our symptoms were like very high fever, really productive cough, and just felt horrible for 4 or 5 plus days. So that did not help. The good news was that I didn't have any bleeding with the influenza, which was like a very huge win, especially as often as I had been having bleeding for like 5 or 6 months. So that felt like a huge win. But my lungs got very gunky. They didn't feel great. And I went to a CF clinic appointment like a week or two after having influenza, and I still had that PICC line in. And they checked my lung function, and it was down a little bit, it wasn't down a lot, but it was down a little bit, and it wasn't a shock, but it was frustrating because I had been on IV antibiotics for like 2.5 weeks, which normally would bring my lung function up, but with the influenza, it definitely didn't. And so they decided to keep me on IV antibiotics for I think a few more days. And then they wanted to kind of reevaluate where my lungs were in, I think, like a month. So that's what we did. We pulled excuse me, we pulled the PICC line out like a few days after that appointment and stopped IV antibiotics. And I got a call from the doctor, or maybe it was a message, a few days after that saying that they had done it's called the sputum culture, but it's where they test the bacteria that I grow in my lungs. And it takes a few days to get the results back. So I got the results back. And normally I have like one thing that I grow, or maybe 2 occasionally. But this time I had 5 different types of bacteria that I was growing. And it was really confusing because, like I said, I just had gotten off 3 weeks of IV antibiotics. And now my lung function's down. And now I'm growing 5 different types of bacteria, 3 or 4 of which I've never grown ever. And they were so rare that my doctors had to look them up because they had not seen them, at least not often. So that was weird and confusing. But we just kind of decided to give it time, let my lungs kind of hopefully recover from the influenza before we kind of decided what, if anything, to do about it. And so that's what we did. And so I think a week or 2 after that, I started coughing up blood again, a little bit, but that was a huge bummer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. That wasn't good news. And then a week later, I did it again, coughed up a little bit more blood, and my lungs still felt crappy. And so I went back to my doctor about a week after that, which was 1 week ago from today. It was last week. And we rechecked my lung function, and it was down a little bit more even from the last time. So now I'm down like 4 percentage points, say, from my baseline, which isn't great. Like, it's not terrible, but I'm not heading in the right direction, which is super frustrating. And now I'm bleeding again, off and on. So it kind of felt like terrible news, I guess, but not shocking with how my lungs felt. So So the doctors are kind of trying to decide what to do with me. Like, do we do more IV antibiotics? I already talked about on one of my videos that I grow bacteria in my lungs all the time. And unfortunately, there are no like oral antibiotics, like pills that I can take that treat what I grow, because I'm either allergic to it or I have a very severe reaction to the medicine and I can't tolerate it, which leaves normally IV antibiotics. So in my mind, I'm thinking, great, this means I'm definitely going to have to get a PICC line again when I just had one 3 or 4 weeks ago. So frustrating. But I had been thinking a lot, especially the last few weeks, just trying to figure out a way to get rid of the bleeding, like what we haven't tried, what we haven't done, and or just have less frequent like IV antibiotics, because I hadn't needed any in like years, but now I needed it a month ago and now I might need it again. Like, how can we avoid this, change this? And it kind of suddenly occurred to me that one of the antibiotics that I had written down as being allergic to since I was like 8 years old, I started really thinking hard about the situation around why we started saying I was allergic to that. So when I was 8 years old, I was put on Cipro, is what it's called. And I think it was for a lung thing. I don't know exactly. But I took this antibiotic and then I was going to go stay with my grandma and grandpa for a week right after I took it. And so my grandma says that on the drive over to her house, I started, like, my face started getting really flushed. And then I think by the time we got to their house, I had like a rash all over. And so we're like, oh, you must be allergic. I think we switched the antibiotic. And I've always said that I'm allergic to Cipro. But I was thinking that Cipro and a lot of the other drugs in that drug class can cause a sun sensitivity reaction. And it was in the summer. And it made me wonder a couple of things. It made me wonder if maybe it wasn't an allergic reaction. Maybe it was just a reaction to the sun that can happen when you're on certain antibiotics. That's one option. Or maybe I am really allergic. But after 30 years, sometimes you can outgrow allergies. And so it might be worth trying it anyway, just to see kind of what happens and if I actually am allergic. And so I mentioned all of this to my CF doctor, who was like, yeah, we need to try this. Like, it's very possible either of those things are true, that maybe it was a sun reaction, or maybe there's another type of reaction you can get from certain antibiotics called red man syndrome. You can Google it if you want, but it just causes a flushed face and rash and some other symptoms. But he said that's actually more common for Cipro than an allergic reaction that presents as a rash, which gave me some hope. Long story short, he put me on Cipro. I started it last week and I have had zero reaction to it in a good way, no allergic reaction, it felt like a huge win. Because now I don't have to go to the hospital. I don't have to do IV antibiotics as the first line of treatment. Like, I have another option where I can just take pills and not change my entire life around anytime I need antibiotics, which is like, I can't believe after 30 years, like, I could have done this probably a good chunk of the time, maybe the whole time. So not to say that I wouldn't have needed IV antibiotics at some point, because sometimes you need a stronger drug than just an oral antibiotic. But it's crazy to me that is now an option, which is like a huge win. So as much as it sucks that my lung function is down and I've had some bleeding, it's huge that I can use Cipro now. And, like, knock on all the wood, I haven't had any bleeding now in over 2 weeks. And I'm hoping that this helps at least. I don't know if it'll permanently get rid of bleeding, but maybe it can stretch it out, which would be like a huge win. So I hope that's how it'll go, but we'll see. I think that's basically it for my physical health update. From a mental health standpoint, So when I met with my therapist at that CF clinic appointment back in December, he said that he wanted me to write down when I have bleeding. He wanted me to write down the thoughts that I'm thinking, and then what emotions those thoughts lead to, and then what behavior those emotions cause, kind of. Just so we could kind of see like that process happen, or like what I'm going through at that time. And because I had about a month with no bleeding when I was doing the IV antibiotics, I was in such a like good like spot mentally, I guess. And I kind of was thinking that, yes, I'll write down these thoughts and emotions and behaviors kind of theoretically, because I'm not having any bleeding right now. So I'll just think back to what I do think and what I do feel and what I do when that happens. But when I had that bleeding, it happened to be like 3 or 4 days before my first therapy appointment. And it was like, oh no, we get the like real-time version of the crisis that I kind of have when I see any blood, when I cough up any blood. And in the past, when I've done this in therapy that I've had in the past, it was normally like pick 1 or 2 thoughts and then do the emotions that they lead to and then the behaviors. But in this case, it was like, I cannot pick 1 or 2 thoughts, because when I see that blood, it is like, I like freeze and like panic. And then it's like 1,000 thoughts happen in 5 seconds. And so when it happened, I was like, okay, he wanted me to write this stuff down. So I went upstairs. It happened to be during Jackson's nap time, which was perfect. And I spent an hour like sobbing and writing down kind of all of the worst case scenario thoughts that I had, and just how to handle, I was kind of like, who do I tell? How do I handle this? What does this mean for my life? What does this mean for my family? What does this mean for my future? And then kind of let myself go to the worst version of all those thoughts and kind of extrapolate them out. And I don't often, when I'm just sitting alone, when if I cough up blood, I'm not sitting there necessarily letting myself get that far ahead of myself, I guess. But for the purposes for therapy, I was like, let me just give him like the worst case thought crisis that I have when it happens. And so I did that. I spent, like I said, about an hour writing, I don't even know how many pages of thoughts that happen in 2 seconds. And then I kind of wrote down, 20 different emotions that all causes, and then some of the behaviors that causes. And then he didn't ask me to do it, but what I had done in the past is do the thoughts and the emotions and behaviors, but then go back to your thoughts and kind of go down the line and reframe all the ones that you can. So for example, and then I let myself kind of own the ones that I felt were true. So like the first thing I wrote down was, this effing sucks. And I'm like, nope, that does effing suck. We're going to leave that one alone. You get to have that one. But I also wrote down, I'm going to spend the rest of my life sitting on my butt and not living it. And I'm a terrible mom because I can't get up and play with Jackson right now. And like a good mom gets up and plays with their kid. And I mean, I even let myself go so far as to say, I'm selfish for even having kids or getting married, because kind of look at the chaos that I cause. And those are all really extreme thoughts. They're based in some facts, but like I don't have to sit on my butt and do nothing. I can do 90+% of the things I want to do when I'm bleeding. I can still do a lot of it. I still am picking Jackson up. I'm still playing with him. I'm not jogging next to him, but I'm doing, so much of what I normally do anyway. And it's only for a few days. Normally the bleeding lasts maybe a day, and then I have 2 or 3 days where I let it kind of heal, and then I can get back to doing whatever I want. So that's kind of how I could reframe that. And, I'm not a bad mom. I make mistakes a lot, but I'm a good mom. So that's not true. And then like the one about me being selfish for even having kids and a husband. I mean, there are elements of that chronic illness does affect the people around you. But I also bring a ton of amazing qualities to my children and to my husband. And so that's not as black and white as my mind wants it to be, to seem. So that was just so, for me, it was so cathartic, I guess, to just let myself have all of the thoughts and the feelings, get it all out of me and put it down on paper, and then kind of like step back from it, slightly removed from some of like the heightened emotion of it, I guess. And it was interesting because in reading it like later, it made me feel, I mean, a part of it made me feel ashamed because I let myself go to such dark places so quickly. And I'd like to believe that like I'm above that or beyond that or something, that I wouldn't let myself do that. So that was kind of interesting. But I also just had like a lot of like compassion for myself, that like, oh wow, like when that happens, this is the reaction that your brain is telling you is happening. Does that make sense? Which is pretty extreme. So it's not surprising that if you're telling yourself these thoughts, you're having all of these emotions. And I guess it was nice to kind of step back from it and watch it outside of myself, I guess. So I think I'll probably do that in the future, because I think it's a good way to, I think I talked about on the last video, like my fear is that I don't want to like hurt the people I love by sharing all those thoughts with them. Because if I share that with my husband or my mom or my sister, you know, or my friends or my dad, any of those people would be affected by those dark thoughts that aren't even necessarily real. And they can kind of spiral from me having those conversations. And I do have some of those conversations to an extent, but to kind of have like a safe place for me to just like get it out of me without affecting others, I think is so helpful for me. So that was hugely beneficial. The other thing that so I met with my therapist and I talked all of this through with him too. And then he had me start doing mindfulness, which I've done this in the past. And before I ever did it a few years ago, I thought it was really like, so what, you're sitting there and you're, you know, like very like peace, love, and harmony, not based in reality, was kind of my initial thoughts before I ever tried it. And there's something so awesome about just like calming your thoughts and not judging your thoughts. And I'm someone that can kind of go in a loop. If I can't get my thoughts out, I can just be stuck in this like loop of thoughts and emotions and thoughts and emotions. And I have noticed that mindfulness has been a really good way for me to just like calm my thoughts. And this is kind of a tangent a little bit, but I listened to a podcast between a man and his wife. His name is, and his wife, I think they're actually separated, but his wife is Laura Clary, who's on social media, if you follow her at all. But Stephen Hilton is a composer. He like composes songs for movies. At least he has in the past. And he recently put out a meditation, I guess, that you can listen to that he was talking about this on the podcast and explaining kind of what it is. And it uses binaural beats and like alpha waves, which I had never heard of any of this stuff. But he said that basically it's certain tones and repetitive like sounds in combination with some music that, how did he word it? Basically, the alpha waves somehow help your brain to relax it kind of puts you into this space of like creativity and daydreaming and problem solving and that type of thing, which just made me kind of interested. And his wife got on there and said it was like one of the best things he's ever made. And so I was like, I'm just going to try it out because I'm doing this whole mindfulness thing anyway. So I listened to it, and it was one of the only things I've done with mindfulness that truly just almost shut off my thoughts. And it was like, I was so calm and so peaceful. And it was like, I was like underwater floating in a good way, or like on a beach or something so peaceful, I guess. And I shared this with my therapist, who said that he had recently just started studying about alpha waves and a bunch of other types of waves, which are like, I think it's like a different frequency, like sound frequency. And I guess alpha waves are supposed to, it's the brain wave form that your brain does right before you fall asleep. And which made so much sense to me when he said that, because that's exactly kind of what it feels like. Like I'm not asleep when I'm doing it, but it puts me in this like really, really calm spot. So that was a really long-winded way of saying that if you are interested in that at all, and this is not an ad or anything, I think I'm going to try and put the link to that video that he made of the sound, the alpha waves, the binaural beats thing on here somewhere. It'll probably be in a comment below the video, but we'll see how I can kind of get at it. I just thought that was really interesting for anybody who cares. What else was I going to talk about? I think, so my therapist also said that, kind of in talking with me, he was like, it seems like you're someone who thinks that if you just think harder and harder, you'll be able to fix whatever problem you have. But even specifically to like my physical health, like I just have to come up with some new way to do whatever it is I'm supposed to be doing, or new treatments, or basically that I can like outthink the problem and that will fix it, which is obviously not realistic. I mean, I have a genetic disease, so that's not really going to, it's not going to be really reasonable. But what makes that super tricky is, like, I thought of, after, I don't know, weeks of thinking, I figured out the fact that I could maybe try Cipro, and maybe it wasn't really an allergic reaction, and maybe that could solve so much of my issues. It may solve some of the bleeding issues, but if not, it at least solves, to some extent, the IV antibiotics hospital issue. And I'm the one who came up with that. I mean, and that sounds kind of arrogant, but it's true. Like, no one has mentioned that in 30 years to me, that I could maybe try Cipro to verify that it's even a real allergy, and or to verify if I'm still allergic to it. And so it just totally reinforces the, like, my thought process that I can just outthink the problem. I just have to think harder and come up with a new plan and a new way, and I'm going to fix it. And then stuff like that happens, and then it actually works, which just reinforces this kind of bad pattern of me thinking I can just control and fix all the things, which is good that I thought of it and it worked, but also bad because now I'm just going to think harder about all the things till I fix it, which isn't like a great way to be, probably. So I don't know where I land with all that, but I was like, that's kind of unfortunate in a way that worked, because now I'm just going to keep thinking about all the things. But I will say, if you are someone with a chronic illness, or your child has a chronic illness, like one of the number one things that I would recommend, and my mom and I talked about this on the podcast, is like educate yourself to the best of your ability on your illness or your child's illness, because you'll have a lot of problems asking the right questions, or thinking through kind of what will be maybe your best treatment, without having some of the base knowledge of like your disease, the human body, pharmacology. And I feel like being a nurse has helped me so much. And obviously I love being a nurse for lots of different reasons that have nothing to do with me and my health. But man, has it benefited my own health, my own treatment. And I can kind of ask very like tailored questions because I have that base knowledge. So I guess do what you can to educate yourself to the best of your ability, because it really does make a difference. And I'm sure early on it would be very overwhelming to start with no experience on the disease and then to have it. Like, I've had my disease my whole life, so it's all I've ever known. So I can't really imagine being like a healthy person and then having an illness all of a sudden. So I have so much empathy for that situation. But for my situation, I've never known anything different. So knowledge is power, I guess. Yeah, I guess that's all I really have to say about it. But it just makes a difference when you know kind of what you're talking about. And you're the expert on you. Even if you haven't had your disease or illness a long time, yes, there's going to be lots and lots of medical professionals that know generically the details of that illness or that disease better than you. But you're the only one that knows how that illness affects your body. And that's huge. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that. The only other thing I was going to talk about was my son, Jackson. So I don't think that I posted anything about him and his speech delay on Breathing It Out Facebook page. I don't think I did. I think it's only the people that are Facebook friends with my like personal page. So when was it? Like a month ago? Well, let me start a little bit from the beginning for those who have no idea what I'm talking about. My son is now 21 months. And for like the last probably 6 months, my husband and I have been really tracking the fact that he wasn't talking quite as much as he should be. I was told by my doctor by his doctor, that by 18 months he was supposed to say, I think 8 to 10 words. And he was probably saying 2 to 3 words, and then he would mimic a few other things, but he wouldn't say it on his own, which I knew he wasn't kind of meeting the, I don't know, average guidelines, I guess, for like what he should be doing by that age. And so my pediatrician referred us to, I think it's called the Early Development Network in Nebraska. And so they basically send someone to our house to evaluate him. They sent 2 people. And so they have him do a whole bunch of things, try to get him to say certain things, point to different things on a book, and then do physical things like run around, throw a ball, a bunch of things like that, just to see where he is completely developmentally, not just the speech thing. And I wrote a post on my Facebook page about that after we got it done, because it was so challenging, I guess, they did that while evaluated him while also asking me a ton of questions too. And I was getting concerned because they would be like, if you ask him, where's the ball? Will he point to it? And I'll be like, oh yeah, he'll point to it. And then we'd ask him, where's the ball? And he did nothing. He was busy doing something else. And I'm like, great, they're not going to believe me. And that just kept happening with like 10 different things. Like I'd be like, oh yeah, he can do this, or oh yeah, he can say this. And then he didn't do it or didn't say it. And it was like, they're not going to believe me. And like, I don't know what I thought the worst case scenario was if they didn't believe me, because I would still know that actually, no, he can do these things. But I don't know. I got so in my head about what does this mean if he can't do these things? And what does this mean if they think he can't do stuff, but he actually can do them? And will that affect like what resources they think he needs, or how any of this plays out, I guess. So I put kind of a long post on Facebook about just that I empathize so much with anybody that has children that are behind in any way. And I realized that the Jackson that I felt was very, not very severe in how far behind I thought he was, but it still was so stressful. So I truly I have so much empathy for anybody that has a child that is struggling in any way like that. And I got so many nice responses, and like, it just gave me so much hope that I was like, okay, like there's so many people that also have had their kids evaluated, and there's a lot of good that can come of it. You know, if he does need resources, that's fine. If he needs resources, then that would benefit him. I mean, I guess it's not a negative. So the interesting thing is, I think a week after they evaluated him is when I kind of got the results of their evaluation. And I guess how it works, at least here, is that they kind of give him a standardized score for how he compares to other children his age on all these different categories. And so in order to qualify for like state resources, I guess, he had to have 3 different areas where he scored less than 80 or one area where he scored less than 70. And he actually scored above 80 in all the categories. And even in speech, he scored like very average, like maybe slightly below average, but still within that normal window kind of. So like the great news is, I guess, is that he didn't qualify for resources because they don't feel he needs them at this point, which was kind of a relief. I'm still kind of working with him constantly and doing all the things I was doing before that. And it's their belief that he will likely catch up by around age 2 or maybe slightly after. They said if I'm still concerned at age 2, then they can reevaluate, and then the criteria kind of changes for the age. And so then maybe he would qualify for resources if he hasn't made a lot of progress. But yeah, that was a relief to me that they felt he wasn't very severe, which was great. The only other thing I was going to add was that it was really funny because right after he had that evaluation, like I swear within 2 days of that, he was talking so much more. Before, a lot of what he was doing, like he would do a little bit of babbling stuff, but it was almost, I'd say the majority was like closed mouth, like, so much of his speech seemed to be like that. And truly within a couple of days of the evaluation, it was like he was babbling and trying to talk constantly. And he had picked up a couple of words in like the week or 2 after that. And now he's really like, if I say, can you say this? Often he'll attempt it. If he doesn't get it right, he'll at least attempt it, which before it was like pulling teeth to get him to even try to mimic what I was saying. I'd have to say it, for 30 minutes straight, and then maybe he'd finally do it. And now it seems a lot quicker. So I feel like he's headed on the right path. I just think he's, on his own timeline, I guess. And a lot of people also said this to me. So my daughter, who's 10 now, she was such an early talker. Like she was just very verbal very early on. And I think the comparison from her, who was kind of probably above average for talking at that age, compared to Jackson, who's probably a little bit below average, seems so much more extreme than it probably is, which just made me more concerned, I guess. So, and I also have heard a lot of people say that, like, on average, boys tend to be just a little bit behind verbally as compared to girls. I don't know if, the truth of that, but I suspect there probably is a bit of a discrepancy, I guess, between boys and girls. But so that was maybe a part of it too. But the good news is they, they think he will be okay. So, which was a huge relief. Yeah. So that's kind of what's been going on the last couple of months, I guess. I go to see I get my lung function checked again in about a month and a half or something. And so we'll hope that the numbers are up. And I'm hoping that the bleeding stops or at least is farther apart. And I'll give you an update when I've got it. Thanks, everybody.